on, and we're just walking through all of those I am statements that Jesus makes during his ministry. So far we've talked about Jesus is the bread of life and Jesus is the light of the world. Tonight we're going to be in John chapter 10, and there's actually two of the statements there in John chapter 10. First, he says that Jesus is the gate for the sheep, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Later in the same chapter, Jesus says that he is the good shepherd. So all of this has to do with this idea of God is our shepherd, Jesus is our shepherd, and we are the sheep, and Jesus is here to take care of us, to provide for us, and to make sure that we're living our lives to the full. So let's dive in. We're going to be reading John chapter 10, verses 1 through 10, and we're going to explore what it means that Jesus is the gate for the sheep. Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Therefore, Jesus said again, "Very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." Jesus uses the analogy here of a sheep and a shepherd. And this analogy of God's people being the sheep and God or Jesus being the shepherd is one of the most common analogies or illustrations that the Bible uses to describe the relationship between God and humankind. Last year we did a sermon series called Herd Community, and we really just looked at that metaphor all over the place. How we saw, the metaphor of sheep and shepherd in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. It's all over. And this was a really powerful illustration because the idea of shepherding was a very common thing during Jesus' day. A lot of the people who listened to Jesus were probably shepherds or new shepherds. It was something that was very familiar, and it was easy to kind of latch onto as a metaphor, as an idea of what our relationship with God is all about. Let me share a quote from you just about this idea of shepherding and how common it is in the Bible as a metaphor. And this comes from Warren Wiersbe in his book on the I Am Statements of Jesus. He says, "The Jewish people have always seen their nation as the flock of Jehovah, cared for by the Lord, their shepherd." And he lists Numbers 27, 2 Samuel 24, Psalm 23, Psalm 74, 77, 78, 79, 80, 100, and then Jeremiah 23, Ezekiel 34, Matthew 15. The image of the flock is also applied to the church in places like Luke 12, Acts 20, Romans 8, Hebrews 13, 1 Peter 5. And spiritual leaders are known as pastors, as in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, from the Latin word for shepherd. And so what Warren Wiersbe, the author of this book, is pointing out is that you go to the Old Testament, the metaphor of sheep and shepherd is there. You go to the New Testament, look at the church, the metaphor of sheep and shepherd is there. And even leaders, servants in the church are referred to as pastors, which comes from the word for shepherd, which is why the word pasture, pastor, it all has to do with shepherding. So God has always described the relationship between him, God, and his people as shepherd and sheep. But there's also the idea here that the leaders that God calls into service or God calls into leadership should function as a human shepherd for the flock that God has entrusted to their care. So God's people are the sheep, and he will appoint leaders who should shepherd the people. The problem is, when Jesus came into our world, there were all kinds of religious leaders that weren't being very good shepherds. So they were called into leadership. They were placed in a position of authority or placed in a position where they should be caring for the flock. But instead of using their position to bless others, they used their position to basically enrich their own lives. I mean, they were selfish, and they took advantage of people, and they stole from people, and they did everything that they could to increase their own wealth or prominence or importance. a lot of times at the expense of the people that they should have been caring for. And that's why when Jesus came into our world and looked over Jerusalem and looked at his people, looked at the nation of Israel, he called them sheep without a shepherd. They had leaders, but they didn't have a real shepherd that cared for them the way that a good shepherd would. So a lot of what Jesus is talking about here is meant to be this compare and contrast. And Jesus is talking directly to the Pharisees, a group of religious leaders. You see that in chapter 10, verse 1. Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees. So he's talking directly to these leaders that should be shepherds, but aren't really being very loving and very generous or very selfless. They're really just making it about themselves. He's telling them, you guys are just thieves and robbers. So he's comparing and contrasting himself, Jesus, the good shepherd, to all of these leaders who were supposed to be caring for others, but really just took from them to line their own pockets and to increase their own fame and fortune. Now, I looked up a little bit more about sheep and about shepherds and how this metaphor is used in the Bible in the Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary. And one of their main things there was basically to say that, yeah, this is meant to show a contrast between Jesus, who really loves the flock and cares for us, versus the religious leaders who only pretended like they cared for the people at all. So in their entry, they say the most developed shepherd and flock imagery of the New Testament appears in the Gospel of John. And they list chapter 10, where we are now, where Jesus' concern for Israel is contrasted with the feigned care of their present leadership. So in what Jesus is saying, he's, contrasting the shepherd with those thieves and robbers that are only trying to break in and steal and kill and destroy. And that would be the difference between Jesus, the good shepherd, and these religious leaders that were really just making it about themselves instead. So the initial I am statement here that he makes before he says that he is the good shepherd, which again will be next week, the first thing he says is that he is the gate for the sheep. And I would say that gate for the sheep is probably the least exciting I am statement on its surface. It sounds just kind of ordinary, it's a word that could mean door or entryway or gate. And there's nothing immediately all that exciting or inspiring about a door, for example. I mean, bread of life, that's kind of interesting. Light of the world, wow, that sounds pretty important. The way, the truth, and the life, those are all big picture concepts. That sounds pretty cool. But the gate for the sheep, I mean, really? Like, what's the significance of that? Well, if you think about the way that shepherding worked back in Jesus's day, the flocks would all be out there just kind of roaming in the fields, and they needed that pasture land for food and nourishment and exercise and water and all that. But then at night, the shepherd would collect all of the sheep in a pen. And this was so important because when night came, that's when the predators came out, the lions and the wolves and maybe even thieves and robbers, and they would want to, steal or eat, one of those lambs. And so the shepherd needed to gather all of his sheep together and keep them safe in some kind of enclosure. So all the sheep would go into this pen, and the shepherd would build up the walls high enough so the sheep couldn't just, walk over it or jump out. And sometimes they would put the equivalent of barbed wire on the top, something sharp, pokey, thorns, something like that, to keep, other people out, basically. And this was so important because out there in the open at night, there were a lot of dangers. So the pen was there for protection, and there would be an opening in the pen that would allow the sheep to come and go. So at different points of the day, the sheep would either need to be inside or outside. And the shepherd, this is what they say about what shepherds did and their role. They say that the shepherd would actually lay down in the gap, lay down in the entryway. And at night, they would sleep in the doorway of this pen so that they would know if any sheep, came and tried to, walk over them and, go wander away. And they would also know if anyone was trying to sneak in. So they were sort of the security system, the motion detector that would, they'd get a notification if anyone tried to come or go, basically. So you have this pen and you have this pasture land, and the sheep needed both at different times, and the gateway, the entryway is what allowed the sheep to come and go. And Jesus kind of talks about the coming and the going there. I want you to think about for a moment what would happen if the sheep were in the pen, but they were stuck there for days or weeks at a time. What if there was no entryway and the wall just went all the way around them? Like all the sheep got inside and then someone finished the wall and there was no way to come in or out. Well, they would certainly be safe from predators, but the problem is they would quickly run out of food and water inside the pen. So the pen is safety, but there's not really any nourishment. On the other hand, if they were always in the pasture land, yeah, they'd have food and water, but they would be really exposed to a lot of dangers. The predators that are out there and the thieves and robbers that just want to pick them off and take them to their own flocks or their own homes or something like that. So there are different times when the sheep really needed to be in one spot versus the other. And the gateway is what allowed them to come and go and experience the right thing at the right time. And because sheep aren't exactly that bright, they need a shepherd to guide them and to lead them and to bring them to the right place at the right time. And that's why it's so important to have a shepherd who really loves us and cares about us and knows what's best for us. I mean, if we're the sheep, that means that we're the ones who need someone to guide us and lead us. So we need to make sure that we're following a shepherd who really cares about us instead of a shepherd that just wants to take advantage of us for his own benefit instead of ours. Jesus says to all of these Pharisees, you guys are supposed to be these good shepherds. God called you to be religious leaders for his people. But instead of shepherding them, you're just taking advantage of them. You're like a thief or a robber. Only the shepherd can just come walking through the gate. The thieves and the robbers, it's not their pen, it's not their sheep. They don't have the right to go walking through the door. Just like only the owners of a house or the renters of an apartment have the right to go enter that home, that residence. If you see someone breaking in through a window, sure, there's like a 1% chance that the rightful owner just got locked out. But more than likely, this is an unauthorized entrance and someone who does not live there is trying to break in, perhaps to steal things. So Jesus is saying, look, if you see someone climbing in over the sides of the walls, that's a good sign that it's not their sheep and it's not their pen. They're just a thief and a robber trying to take advantage or steal or kill or destroy the flock. And he says, Pharisees, that's you guys. He is accusing them of neglecting the flock or even taking advantage of the flock. Now, I mentioned that this idea of shepherd and sheep as a metaphor is all over the Bible, and that's true. The language here of thieves and robbers, sort of the accusation that Jesus makes about these religious leaders, that's not all that common in the Bible. You can do a search for thief or robbers or robbing and things like that, and you'll get a few sporadic hits here and there, but there seems to be a decent amount of hits, decent amount of times when this is used in the prophetic books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. And there kind of came this point in Israel's history after they've entered the promised land and their kingdom has been established. Those kings that were supposed to take care of the people and lead them well as the priests who were supposed to be offering sacrifices in the temple and pointing people back to God's laws, they really stopped serving the way a shepherd would, and they started to use their position for selfish reasons. So God frequently called them out on using their position for selfish reasons, and he accused them of neglecting the people that they were supposed to be caring for. And as he does that, robbing, stealing, taking advantage of people, taking things that aren't yours, committing acts of violence. These are all the accusations that God makes about these leaders that should be servants and shepherds, but are really just using their position for selfish gain. So let me just give you a couple examples of that. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 23. God says about Israel, your rulers are rebels, partners with thieves. They all love bribes and chase after gifts. They do not defend the cause of the fatherless. The widow's case does not come before them. So instead of using their prominence, their position to help those, especially the vulnerable, they're just trying to take as much as they can for their own, line their own pockets at the expense of everybody else. Another spot where this idea of thieves and robbers comes up is Jeremiah chapter 7. And you might actually know this passage because it's quoted by Jesus in the New Testament too. But here's what God says. Will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal and follow other gods you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which bears my name, and say, we are safe, safe to do all these detestable things? Has this house, which bears my name, become a den of robbers to you? But I have been watching, declares the Lord. So he's saying, look, you're acting like you're right at home here in the temple, but I know what you've been doing. I know your practices. I know that you're committing, idolatry, you're lying, adultery, you're stealing. You're turning my house into a den of robbers and thinking that you're still justified in your lifestyle, in your choices. And God said, that's crazy. So Jesus quotes that when he goes to the temple and overturns all the tables there. A couple examples of this language of thieves and robbers, that these accusations that God makes about either his people or the leaders of the people, Ezekiel 18 and Ezekiel 22. In Ezekiel 18, God compares and contrasts a righteous father and his violent son. And the righteous father does, basically everything right, never steals from people, always treats people kindly, seeks justice and things like that. But his son says that he eats at the mountain shrines, he defiles his neighbor's wife, he oppresses the poor and needy, he commits robbery. He does not return what he took in a pledge. He looks to the idols, he does detestable things, he lends at interest and takes a profit. Will such a man live? He will not. So amongst all of these other immoral, shady things that this evil, violent son is doing, God says he commits robbery. He's taking things that don't belong to him. And then in Ezekiel chapter 22, God really lays into the leaders of Israel and says, you guys are like lions trying to tear their prey apart, or wolves tearing their prey apart. And instead of caring for this flock, you're just attacking them. And God says, look, I'm looking for someone among them who would build up the wall and stand before me in the gap on behalf of the land so that I would not have to destroy it, but I found no one. No one was willing to stand up and defend God's flock and defend them from harm and really care for them. Because God couldn't find anyone who was willing to build that wall and stand in the gap, God's wrath and judgment was going to come, on the land, on all of the people. So you have this language of sheep and shepherd in the Old Testament, and you also have this language of thieves and robbers, that God's people should have been good shepherds, but instead they turned into thieves and robbers who took advantage of the flock instead of caring for it. So when Jesus says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full, Jesus is just further illustrating how far the religious leaders of the day have fallen from the lofty standard that God has given them. They should be shepherds who lay down their lives for the sheep, who care for them, who protect them, but instead they're just taking advantage of the flock. And all of that is so different than the kind of shepherd that Jesus is for us, which we will talk about next week as well. One of the things that Jesus does say in our passage tonight is that the shepherd knows the names of his sheep. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that so cool? Like, I don't know how many sheep a shepherd would have, but it's got to be a huge amount, and yet he knows all of them by name. So he knows their names, and then the sheep know his voice. And I found some YouTube videos on this, and it's totally true. Like, there's this video of a flock, a herd, of sheep, and there's a shepherd, and the shepherd has his particular call. And when he does this particular call and in his own voice, of course the sheep come running. Well, the video is that shepherd's friends do their very best to imitate the shepherd's call in the same tone of voice, in the same pitch, in the same kind of repetitive thing that he says. And even though it sounds almost, it's pretty close, almost identical, the sheep don't budge until the actual shepherd gives the call. And then, of course, they come running. And it's so cool to see this principle at play. It's true, it's real life stuff, that the sheep know the voice of their shepherd, and the shepherd knows their name. And out of the nearly 8 billion people in this world, the 8 billion people, 8 billion sheep in the flock, God still knows our name. We're not just a random number or face in a crowd to him, But God created us, and He loves us, and He sees us, and He knows us, and He knows us by name. And one of my favorite passages that makes that point is Isaiah chapter 49, verses 15 and 16. And I really like it in the New Living Translation, so that's what I'm going to read for you. But it says, "Can a mother forget her nursing child? Can she feel no love for the child she has borne? But even if that were possible, I would not forget you. See, I have written your name on the palms of my hands." And that's what God says about His people. That's what God says about His sheep, His flocks. That's what He says about you and about me, that our name is written on the palms of His hands. And He knows our struggles. He knows what we're going through. He is a good shepherd, and He does see us. And as the gate, He is the access point. There are times when we really need to come into His presence through prayer and meditation, maybe coming to church, to come into a place that's safe, where we can find rest and protection from the harms and the evils of our world. And we can experience that protection when we enter through Jesus. But we're not really designed to stay there forever. At the same time, we need to be out in the pasture land. We need to be out there getting nourishment and food and water and exercise. And God knows that we need a time to gather and a time to go out into our world. And as we come and as we go, when we do it through Jesus, we do it through our good shepherd who knows us and loves us and cares about us. So even though the idea of Jesus, the gate for the sheep, isn't as glamorous as some of the others, it is a beautiful image when you understand what a sheep pen was like and what it was for, how it protected the sheep from harm. It gave them a safe place to rest, and knowing that we need to pasture as well, that Jesus gives us the ability to go out into the pasture to find the nourishment that we need. So whether we're coming or going, it's all under the watchful eye of Jesus, the Good Shepherd, who really cares for us, unlike all of the other leaders or so-called leaders of our world who really are only in it for themselves. Jesus has laid down His life for the sheep because He is the Good Shepherd who loves us. So maybe I bled into next week's class a little bit, but we'll cover the rest of that idea of Jesus being our Good Shepherd next week in the second part of John chapter 10. But thanks for watching tonight. I hope you guys are having a fantastic